Appreciate everyone being able to join us today for our monthly legislative committee meeting. Got quite a few updates to go through, and I'll try to monitor the chat as we go, see if you have questions there. But it's a pretty good sized group that we've got, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. As you all know, my name's Tony Walters. I'm the Executive Director, National American Indian Housing Council, based here in Washington, D.C. I am in the office today. It's a quiet office here. Most of our office is teleworking, of course, following the Washington, D.C. guidelines, but we're all busy here at NAIHC. So if you got any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of the staff here about legislative issues or training and TA issues as well. We want to make sure that you all are aware that we're busy working throughout this time as well. We know you're all super busy working in your home communities, delivering as much service as you guys can to your tribal members and your communities back home. So appreciate all the work you do and appreciate you joining us today to hear some of the updates of what we're working on the legislative front. And as I said, we've got quite a bit of updates to share. So we'll jump into it. First off, I keep the roll call on the agenda. I'm not sure why. This is a recording, so please be aware of that. You should have been notified when you joined the meeting. We'll try to post this recording afterwards, but because of that, we have a log of who's attending. So feel free to say hi in the chat feature or ask a question or let us know where you're from or which organization you're with. But we're going to jump right in to the updates here. This is meant to be a conversation and not just me talking. So feel free to interrupt if you've got a question. You can try to use the raise your hand feature. I try to look at that. And then also I'm monitoring the chat as well. So feel free to interrupt me if you've got any questions. We'll go ahead and get started. One of our constant or big two priorities, I would say we always have two priorities at NAIHC. One is NAHASDA reauthorization and the other is funding. So we'll talk about both of those today. The first thing we'll talk about is just our NAHASDA reauthorization bills that we're seeing in Congress, and the first one being Senate Bill S-2264. This is a bipartisan bill. It's got 9 co-sponsors, including the leadership of the current Senate Committee for Indian Affairs, Senators Schatz and Murkowski as chair and vice chair of the committee, and then the former leadership of the committee as well, Senators Tester and Hoeven, who were the chair and vice chair of the prior Congress. So good bipartisan support for this bill. And it's a good bill, as we've talked about before on this call. You can see some of the provisions in this Senate NAHASDA reauthorization on the slide. I won't go through them all. The key ones are really the assistant secretary position, getting that internal advocacy at HUD within an administration if this bill were to pass. Also, it reauthorizes NAHASDA for 10 years. So it reauthorizes programs up through 2032, which, as you know, have been expired for 8 years after the last reauthorization. So it makes some sense for Congress to try to extend those authorizations out as it become troublesome to pass these reauthorization bills. And that's not just for tribal programs, of course. That's for kind of any program that Congress considers or implements throughout their term. So it's a good bill. Like I said, we're working with the Senate committee staff and leadership there on how to move this bill through the Senate. Hopeful to see a markup of the Senate bill hopefully in the next work period, but we're still working with them. In addition to moving this as a standalone bill, I know it's always a priority, and one of the key mechanisms to move tribal bills generally is by attaching bills like this to other larger must-pass bills like annual appropriations measures, national defense authorization bill, things like that. So I know the NAHASDA bill has been drafted kind of as an amendment as well to these other packages. So we can always trying to find ways to tack NAHASDA and other bills onto these must-pass pieces of legislation. So we'll go on to the next one. Here's where there's some updates on the House side. There's not a bill that's been introduced on the House side, but there is a discussion draft that's been released, and folks should be able to see that if you go to the House Financial Services Committee. It's very similar to past House bill efforts, House reauthorization efforts that we've seen in the past couple of years. And again, I've got the list of kind of the key provisions, and there's more to it. But here, because we haven't talked about this bill so much on these calls, I'll go through this list. One, it does establish that assistant secretary assistant position for Indian Affairs or Indian Housing at HUD. It has some TDC allowances for energy efficiency upgrades when you're building new units, has the HUD-VASH language in it, has a 5% tribal set aside for USDA programs. And that's not limited to just the single family home loan program, but several USDA programs. So it's probably a little bit more robust than some of the other efforts we've seen regarding USDA and tribal funding. The House version has tribal eligibility for the HUD counseling grants. We're all still working kind of with the HUD counseling program to understand how those rules apply to tribal programs, and when some of the TDHEs across the country are providing housing counseling type services. So it makes no sense to have those rules pushed upon TDHEs when TDHEs aren't even eligible for the underlying grant program. So we're working on that on a legislative level, and that's included in the House bill as well. The House bill has some other provisions relating to exempting tribes from the flood insurance program, which would put them on parity with states. And then the 184 tribal court jurisdiction issue that we've seen in the last few years, the House bill would address that. This House bill was subject to a hearing at the very end of July. I was able to testify on behalf of NAHC. There were other witnesses there, and the hearing largely surrounded the Freedmen issue, which is a membership issue out of Oklahoma affecting 5 tribes there. And as you can see on the slide, it talks about issues with the House version of the bill. And there's 2 issues. One is that the Freedmen issues has provisions in it that target those 5 tribes, and the tribes don't support that provision. So certainly as a membership organization, as an organization that supports tribal sovereignty, self-governance, we're not going to be able to support provisions when the tribes themselves that would be impacted can't support them. So that's one of the issues. But even larger an issue for all of our tribal housing programs, this NAHASDA bill that the House is looking at sets the funding authorizations too low. If you know NAHASDA now, the current language in law lets Congress appropriate such sums as necessary, and that's the language under the current NAHASDA statute. This bill would actually amend that to put numbers in for each of the fiscal years. So you'd be kind of capping an authorization or appropriation level each year. And we've been asking for something similar. Obviously, we want the NAHASDA funding to grow each year with inflation, with construction costs, with need, and we haven't seen that in 20 years. So certainly, having a bill that steps up the appropriation or authorization for the program is a good idea. However, this bill, sets that authorization too low. It sets it in the first year, would authorize NAHASDA funding at $680 million for this FY22 year, and that's actually already lower than what the Biden administration has proposed in its budget, and it's lower than what the House appropriation, or the full House has actually passed in the THUD appropriations measure earlier this summer as well, where it appropriated $722 million for the Indian Housing Block Grant. So that's the bigger issue with this particular House NAHASDA reauthorization bill, is that it would reauthorize the program, but then it also caps funding at a level that's much too low. As you know, we've been advocating for almost $1 billion in IHBG funding just to make up for the lack of inflation and other increases in cost since NAHASDA was first enacted back in 1996. So we're working with them to make sure that that type of language gets taken out. That language is kind of a holdover from the prior Congress. You had a Republican lead sponsor, and they, when we're counting cost of bills, it was kind of a practice to have the actual amounts in the bill. But here, because those amounts are lower than what we would like to see and lower than what we're already seeing in budgets and appropriations, we need to have that change. It wouldn't make any sense to have this type of cap in a NAHASDA bill. So I just want to highlight that here. We expect to see this bill get marked up sometime this month. There's a notice that it could be on September 13th. So we're certainly working with the committee members and committee staff to recognize the error kind of here in this drafting. And this is still just a discussion draft. That the actual bill hasn't even been introduced formally with the House. So there's some time to make this correction. And then obviously for those tribes who would be impacted by certain provisions in this section 604 out of this House bill that would impact the 5 tribes of Oklahoma, we'll certainly make it aware that NAHC certainly doesn't support things where the tribes themselves that are impacted don't support the provision. So we'll continue working on that, but wanted to let you all know this bill is kind of moving quickly in this sense. It's an odd kind of process where they haven't introduced the bill formally and before it goes to markup. But because of the hearing at the end of July, I think Chairwoman Waters and other members of the committee just trying to move this bill along. It's also, impacting the idea of how much funds tribes could get through a infrastructure package, which we'll talk about here in a little bit as well. So it's all just kind of coming together on the House side as we start considering annual appropriations moving forward and the infrastructure package. So those are the two NAHASDA reauthorization bills that we've seen, one on the Senate, one on the House side, and kind of the latest updates there. This next slide, as I mentioned before, we've talked about working with members of Congress to include NAHASDA as an amendment to other bills that we know are going to pass or Congress always passes each year. And that's underway as well. So in addition to the standalone process where you see a bill go through committee, go through markup, get a vote by the full House or Senate on an individual bill, there's always an effort to tack on things like NAHASDA to a larger bill. So we're working with our members of Congress who champion these tribal housing issues to do that. And we know some of those are kind of already in the works. The other bill there is one we've always talked about as well. It's a larger national housing policy bill, also would reauthorize NAHASDA through 2032. I need to correct that, that's an older version. And it would authorize NAHASDA funding at, I believe, $2 billion in the first year, and then include the such sums, and let's say $2.5 billion, sorry, in the first year. But that's just a bill that's unlikely to pass in its current form, but that is another effort to pass or reauthorize NAHASDA. And that particular bill I know has the issue where a lot of tribes have been talking about. We've got resolutions at the NHC level about getting tribes access again to the Section 8 voucher program. And we've had some more talks with some folks on the Senate side as well about that idea. It's just another, that voucher program, the voucher funding is a very high budget item for HUD. So, adding tribes back to that would probably not be a big burden to the overall voucher program, but it would certainly free up a lot of the tribal resources to NAHASDA to dedicate back to new unit construction, things like that. So always working on that issue with the Section 8 vouchers, and that bill, that's actually included in some of these bills that we've seen introduced. And that bill is introduced on both the Senate and the House side as companion bills. So with that, I'll stop right there just to open up the floor kind of to talk about NAHASDA generally, efforts that we can help with or undertake in the next few weeks. I've talked about sending a letter out for the Senate side, trying to get some co-sponsors of that bill. That bill has 9 co-sponsors, but in the next couple of days, we'll probably be sending out the update on just the House version, because if we're going to see a hearing or a markup on a discussion draft, we want to make sure the tribal voice is heard on that bill, particularly around that authorization issue, because that's a big issue for tribes. We've been lobbying, advocating for more funding and resources for years and years, and to see a NAHASDA bill, move forward with authorization caps is something that is kind of in the wrong direction, particularly when those caps are lower than what we'd be seeing already through the annual appropriations process. So I'll open it up here. Any questions or comments about NAHASDA reauthorization?
I have a question. This is Jackie. Can you speak again about the differences or what the options are with having on the HUD counseling recommendations?
Well, just so the HUD counseling provision in the House bill would really just make that grant program open its eligibility up to tribes, similar to the Continuum of Care program and the provision we saw. So we're still working with HUD on what those requirements to comply with the housing counseling rules and regulations would be, and how.
So it doesn't fix the requirement that HUD already has to.
No, it doesn't touch.
I was hoping that you would have something that would fix it so it wouldn't be a requirement but an option. To me, that seems like a better way to go. I think that the option is driven by a lot of consultants and firms who do this housing counseling job for HUD and get quite a good amount of money to do that. And, you know, I was hoping that tribes would actually have an option to participate rather than a restriction, a requirement to participate.
Yeah, no, that's a good comment, Jackie. Thanks for that. I think, you know, we're still working a little bit on that on the administrative side too, is right. We're trying to find ways to exempt tribes from these rules. And the consultations that we had earlier this year with the HUD counseling program, you know, it was very clear that unless tribes were carrying out kind of all, I think there were 5 specific requirements of the HUD counseling program, then they kind of fall outside of those rules if the tribe isn't providing all 5 of those components. And you know, some tribes may be doing all 5 of those components and some may not. So we're still working with HUD how maybe to handle this administratively to lessen that burden on the
Right, but I still think I mean, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I still think it flies in the face of self-determination. And secondly, I mean, we're just starting to add in a bunch of rules that were just like HUD rules all over the place to NAHASDA. And to me, that's a red flag. And, you know, and then on top of it, you know, like even, you know, in other areas like the continuum of care, they have other requirements that, you know, like I'm dealing with on my youth homeless initiative, where they're saying that I need to have on my board a person that represents, you know, lived experience. And I'm trying to let them know this is our board is appointed through a political process, blah, 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 you know, and I feel like there's just a lot of creep because HUD doesn't get self-determination and how tribes is you know, is operating, and we're not pushing back anywhere, you know. And I think the counseling place is a place to push back, and hopefully we'll do that in other places like the environmental reviews, as well as these other programs that we have access to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I think, you know, as we work through these issues, both at the administrative level and with Congress, you know, the idea is until NAHASDA is kind of brought back up to the levels it needs to be, and we're trying to gain access to these other programs in the meantime, you know, we do fall into that trap kind of where as we get access to these new pots of money that tribes haven't traditionally had access to, it often has its own rules and regulations that tribes have to follow rather than just kind of incorporating them into a tribal NAHASDA program or existing TDHE structure. So we'll be mindful of that, more mindful of that moving forward, and figure out ways that we can try to streamline this as much as we can while, you know, both lobbying or advocating for more funding under NAHASDA and then more access to these other programs as well. But those are all good notes about, you know, just the burden that tribes are under when they get access to some of these new funds. I see some comments about asking for the sponsors on the various versions of the bill. I think they're on the slides, but I'll try to send a follow-up email to after today with just a list of sponsors. There's also a question in the chat about can we provide draft letters, and that's what I was referring to. We do have a platform for that, and we can send that out. When we send those letters out, there's 2 options. One, you all can edit those letters to kind of tailor to your own tribes, but also you can just kind of hit submit and it goes to your members of Congress as well as drafted. So it's kind of trying to make it as easy as we can for all of you, but we'll make sure we send that out in the next couple of days as we get closer to both sides of Congress kind of getting back to work this month here in September. So any other thoughts or questions about NAHASDA before we keep going? Okay. No real
This is Juan Aguilar. How are you?
Good, Juan. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I'm glad to see that also Ed Goodman is on the phone. What can you tell us about, changing gears a little bit, about the U.S. Department of Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program? Initially, when the contracts were let out and we qualified for funding, we had until December 31, 2021 to disperse funds according to the letter of the ERA program. And now I believe there's been some amendments that cut it back to September 30th. I see something here that I didn't see before. Does it mean that we now have until September 30th, 2022 to use up the funds? It wasn't shortened, but in fact it was lengthened.
Mm-hmm.
any updates that you can give us that are tangible for the administration of this program?
Yeah, we've got a few slides on that a little bit later, but just to answer that question
Oh,
now,
okay.
the deadline is extended to September 30th of 2022, which is next year, to
Great,
spend all of
okay.
your rental assistance funds. There is a
Okay.
deadline coming up soon that I'll talk about as well. And I think that's what creates the confusion, because there's a deadline for each September 30th. But we'll get to that. But there is.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
We are confused here at the Yakima Nation Housing Authority.
Sounds good. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, and we'll get to that a little bit more in depth too in a minute after we go through some of the other just housing bills. And I'll try to get there quickly because a lot of this is stuff we've seen recently. Like I said here on the other housing bills, HUD-VASH and the Rural Home Ownership Improvement Act, not a lot of updates over this past month on these bills. HUD-VASH is included in both versions of NAHASDA. We don't see a standalone bill yet. We're still working on the best way to do that. I know there's amendments as well drafted for just adding HUD-VASH to bills as well. I know that's a bill we've seen close to getting passed a couple of times in the last few years. So we're just trying to find that right timing, right entry point to get that bill introduced and passed in a quicker way rather than have it set out there and just kind of get fallen by the wayside like it has the last couple of Congresses. So not a lot of updates on that specifically, but it is being talked about. It is in the larger NAHASDA pieces as usual. So that's the update on HUD-VASH, which is kind of the similar update we've been giving on that. The Rural Home Ownership Improvement Act, this is the USDA bill that would create the not necessarily a set aside, but $50 million set aside from USDA for the single family home loan program, allocating some of those funds through native CDFIs to carry out mortgage lending in tribal communities directly by native CDFIs rather than the USDA. So we've seen the progress and just the achievements of that pilot program in South Dakota there. So this bill would expand that across all of Indian country and get other tribes eligible to this pilot program so we can see more USDA dollars flowing into tribal communities rather than the levels that we've been seeing over the last decade or so, which are pretty low number of home loans through this USDA program in tribal communities, and particularly on trust land. But so this pilot's had a lot of success, and we're trying to duplicate that. We've got a lot of momentum behind this bill as well because of the sponsors that have been engaged, and we'll certainly keep engaged. And they've got a good track record of getting some of these provisions done or passed, as we've seen with Tina Smith and others getting the continuum of care bill passed. There's needs to fix that as well, but certainly making progress there on that issue.
Tony, this is
Yeah.
Joanna. Can I say one quick thing on that bill, on the 502 relending?
Of course.
Just to give an update that the folks in South Dakota through the coalition are talking to Representative Johnson about a House companion bill. But we also wanted to see if there's anyone, we're looking for a Democratic sponsor in the House.
Mhm.
And a suggestion was made that perhaps the newly elected Congresswoman from New Mexico, Teresa Leger Fernandez, she might be interested in being a co-sponsor. So I just wanted to, if there's anyone on the call from New Mexico that's interested and has a relationship with her, if you could just type in the chat box or email me, and so we can just strategize about a House companion bill.
Yeah,
So-
and I know we've got a lot of folks from New Mexico on the call, so hopefully they're hearing this and can reach out to you or me. I see Denise already volunteering there as well, Denise Zuni, and I'm happy to chat offline too, Joanna, about targets for that type of effort.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony.
You bet. You bet. So we'll switch gears a little bit here, just moving on to infrastructure and the updates there. As we've kind of gone through the summer and this fall, August recess in Congress, there's still these two efforts on infrastructure, right? So there's this bipartisan deal that you've seen about in the news kind of through July that got passed by the Senate. It's sitting over at the House, but that bipartisan deal, it has no housing, and not just tribal housing, it has no rural housing provisions in it at all. It focuses on other types of infrastructure, water issues, bridges, roads, things like that. The Democratic side is looking to do a larger infrastructure package, and I'm sure you've seen this in the news as well, and they're using this budget reconciliation process where they can pass pieces of legislation with simple majorities rather than needing bipartisan support. And this is the package that would include housing. If you look at the Biden proposal for this larger piece, it was over 200 billion for housing nationally, specifically kind of earmarked 2 billion for NAHASDA programs. They do claim that other parts of the housing provisions would be eligible for tribes as well, but at least 2 billion dedicated solely to NAHASDA programs. And then there's a discussion on how that's broken down. We heard from the administration officials back in our July call that their original kind of proposal was what you see on the slide here, breaking down the 2 billion into 3 pots, 650 million for the normal block grant, 350 million for ICDBG, and half of it, or 1 full billion, for the competitive IHBG grants, and trying to spur construction along through kind of an infrastructure lens in that way. We've seen the House Financial Services Committee draft that had also 2 billion for the block grant, and that was more geared towards just going through the block grant itself. So there are still some options here. I know they're getting close, kind of here in DC, between the parties involved about what the actual numbers are. There may be some room to make changes to specific programs or ratios of funding, but I think the top level dollars are very close to being kind of settled. And it seems like tribes are still going to be locked around the 2 billion area, which I know we'd certainly like to see more. If you're thinking about set asides of this package, it's arguably just a 1% set aside, 2 billion out of 200. But at the same time, it's still a lot of resources. So we're still working with folks on the Hill about that, but we know that they're getting close to the deadlines on what the actual funding numbers would look like. And then it's kind of a scramble to make sure the language conforms with congressional rules and things like that it delves more onto the budget side and not policy, because this budget process requires things to be almost strictly budget issues and not policy. So that process is still kind of underway and working through here in Washington. Dave, you got your hand up there.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I would just mention that you're absolutely right on. This is a critical time. We understand that the larger reconciliation package will be marked up by September 13th, and that most of the numbers dividing the bigger committee amounts, as you said, each committee has received pretty much what's going to be its allocation, but the committees will have language in place by September 10th. The Friday before the 13th to basically fund each program, including whatever NAHASDA is going to be given. So this week and next week are kind of critical times to kind of pepper your members of Congress, pepper the members of those committees. If you're advocating for any amount of money there, UNAHA has prepared an advocacy letter asking that they consider, just like other programs that they're funding, that they look at a 10-year window. The reconciliation allows for 10 years of consideration of budget. And so it's nice to have those numbers for 2 billion in there for the NAHASDA programs, but that should be every year for 10 years out of this package, not just one and done. And so we just want to put that on the record. UNAHA's out there trying to look at the entire 10-year window that'll be funded by the reconciliation bill and see if we can maintain that $2 billion over each year over the course of those course of the 10-year period.
Well, thanks, Dave. And like I said, we'll try to get more kind of information out through our emails after this call. I saw a note in there about the slides as well. So after this, probably tomorrow, we'll try to have this recording ready to post and send the slides and some of these draft letters that we've been talking about on both the NAHASDA front and maybe just some updated guidance on the infrastructure package where we are. Certainly encourage all of you to be reaching out to your members. For House Financial Services, if you look at the roster of that committee, just not a lot of tribal background, not a lot of representatives with tribal constituencies. So it's been a lot of education there, of course, with the committee, as it always is. But here, because there's few representatives that have bigger tribal constituencies, it's a little bit more education than usual, I would say. So certainly, if you all are talking to your members of Congress and urging them for making sure tribal programs and tribal housing are included, push them to reach out to their colleagues, because that's part of the education process as well. As not just hearing it from groups like ours or directly from you all, but other members of Congress, letting them know their priorities. So certainly encourage all of you to continue reaching out to your members of Congress in both chambers, the Senate and the House.
Yep. Just because it's next week is a short week with Labor Day, don't let that fool you.
Yeah. And Dave mentioned one of the deadlines there, I think of September 13th. I think that's kind of the timeframe we've seen from the House Financial Services on both kind of a bigger markup, and that might include the NAHAZA version, which is still the discussion draft, but obviously it's more going to be geared to, I think, this infrastructure package. They've been talking about some ER rental assistance fixes as well moving forward, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a moment once we get to the rental assistance portion of the call. Any other questions here on infrastructure? Well, real quick, I'll just go through the FY22 budget briefly, because it's not a real big update here since the last call. As we've talked about, the Biden administration every year puts out, or each administration puts out its budget each year. The Biden administration had $1 billion for tribal NAHAZA programs, tribal housing programs, which is a great increase from what we've seen over the prior years, prior couple of administrations really. So this was a big step up for tribal housing budget proposal. And that's actually translated to the House and Congress, also bumping up their appropriations for tribal housing programs. And this is the annual funding that you would get every year. The House passed their THUD appropriations bill towards the end of July. So this is where the appropriations for NAHAZA programs are for FY22, which will be starting soon. Has $722 million for the housing block grant formula, which is probably a 70 million or so increase from what we've seen over the last decade or more. And then 150 million for the competitive grant, which we've seen at 100 million for the last couple of years. So both, because the budget was asking for more, the House appropriators felt like they could put in more based on that request and based on the priorities that tribes have expressed, that you all have expressed to your members. And just moving forward with THUD appropriations, we're seeing some bumps in larger annual funding for tribal housing programs, which is great. Not quite where we want to see them yet. Of course, we're trying for $1 billion just for IHBG to keep pace with inflation since NAHAZA was enacted. But we're seeing some increases here. So that's always great to see. Haven't seen Senate versions get through markups or passing anything yet. So that's still a work in progress as well. But certainly seeing better marks for these numbers and these programs each year than we have in the past. So that's really the update on the budget. The next month or two is really going to be focused on the infrastructure side more than anything. Obviously, those will kind of come in conjunction, right? You're going to see both sides of the aisle, using infrastructure, using appropriations to, as part of their negotiation tactics. So, if we're getting a lot of funds in infrastructure, I would assume Republicans on both sides in the House and the Senate are going to try to be pulling back annual appropriations for some of these programs. So we'll see what happens. Certainly, we're working with everyone who's, certainly has a hand in tribal housing funding, tribal housing programs. We have allies on both sides of the aisle. So we're working with everyone we can to make sure tribal housing programs see these bumps that we're seeing starting coming out, and hopefully they'll stay in the annual bills moving forward. So that's FY22. Here's a chart that I think we've sent this out in our newsletter before. It just shows the president's budget and compared to prior years. So you can see kind of how it's improved. This year's budget proposal was improved, even though a little bit's already been taken off on the appropriation side, as we just talked about. But you can take a look at that a little bit later. Before we get to the rental assistance and the Treasury program, I just want to put this slide up about the HUD ONAP grants, or grants out of HUD. They're not all out of ONAP, but right now I believe there are 6 grants that HUD has out that tribes are either eligible for as part of a national program, or are the tribal specific grants that we're all familiar with. And I've got them listed here. The ICDBG American Rescue Plan pot of funding. It's been under kind of the phase 1 right now, to where tribes who were not funded under the CARES Act could update their applications and maybe get some funds under this new funding pot of money that was included in the American Rescue Plan Act. Tomorrow, actually, it goes into phase 2, where the tribes who didn't have applications in for the CARES or can start applying again. And that application window is open for about a month and a half. And even that's going to be kind of have two tiers. So the first tier is the tribes that weren't awarded under CARES at all. Second tier, tribes that were fully funded under ICBG CARES or anyone else, essentially. Hopefully that makes sense now that I'm saying that, or now that I'm reading it. I may have worded it a little bit awkwardly, but it is just kind of tiered and staggered based on if tribes receive funding under ICBG CARES Act, which was passed last year back in, I believe, March or April of 2020. So that's an ongoing program. The annual ICDBG that we see every year, this year is about 76 million. That's open now as well. They posted that NOFA online. The deadline for those applications is October 25th of this year. The IHBG competitive for FY21. This is the 100 million or so a year grant for competitive grants. That's out as well and open. That deadline is December 1st of this year, 2021. So those are the tribal specific grants that we're all pretty familiar with. The other three grants listed are national grant programs that tribes are just eligible for. And some of them have deadlines that are coming up pretty quickly. We've been trying to get these out in our newsletters the last few, probably month or two. But so these are the Resident Opportunity and Self-Sufficiency Grants, which has a deadline of September 17th. Not a large program for 35 million for kind of a national applicant pool, but tribes are eligible for that. The Eviction Protection Program, jumping to the last one there, I think only 20 million nationally. Hopefully that's the latest number there. I know some of these may have been supplemented with either ARP or other funds, but that's the number that I saw. That deadline is this coming week, September 8th, 2021. There is a Continuum of Care program that tribes are kind of gaining eligibility for because they're kind of still undergoing some consultation on that. They didn't quite know how to fit tribes in. I believe tribes are only eligible to apply within existing continuums of care, whereas in the future, tribes and tribal areas can kind of create their own continuums of care that would be direct applicants for this program moving forward. But for this year only, tribes kind of do have to still work within the existing continuum of care framework that kind of covers their area or region. That deadline is November 6th. So we've still got some time there, but that's a very large program, of course, trying to combat homelessness issues across the country. So certainly we'll work with folks at HUD to try to get as much guidance and training or technical assistance out to tribes before these deadlines. Any questions about these HUD grants before we move on? The next ones are the Treasury grants that we'll talk about for a little bit, but any questions here? Okay. So real quick, so we're going to talk about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Here's just some kind of generic slides about it, about some of the deadlines. The reporting guidelines have kind of come out. They've been kind of changed and modified here or there. I think this is the latest. The guidance was released back in late June. Actually, I think it got updated in July. But some partial reporting were due back on August 6th. I think that was applicable to all the grantees, but it wasn't quite as onerous as they originally announced. So hopefully there was some better ability for your tribal programs to submit your data by that deadline. They did update their FAQ just this past week with some new changes. I didn't get a chance to look at it so quick or so much in depth on what the full changes were. I think it was largely some just streamlining a few things. They are, fully recommending use of self-attestation forms to try to ease the burden on both the individual or family applying, ease the burden on the program that's, sorting applications, reviewing applications. So trying to make things easier to get this money out the door. And the reason for that, you've probably seen the news, the larger ERA program, it says 20%, but that's only 20% of the ERA 1 funds, and states and other localities have gotten another bucket under the ERA 2. So I think it's an even less percentage. It may be down to 10% or so nationwide spending on the rental assistance program. So certainly a lot of work to do to get that money out the door to those families and individuals that need it. Those percentages and numbers don't have the tribal data included. We're working with Treasury folks to see, when we might be able to find some of that kind of aggregated tribal data to see where tribes are generally with the program. But overall, working with Treasury, working with some of the other non-tribal grantees, state and county associations, state housing finance agency associations, on just writing some letters to Treasury with some updates on what would help these programs. There was a call earlier today between some of these larger organizations like ours for the non-tribal side, and I was part of some of those discussions, just trying to extend that 12 or 15 month eligibility period to longer, just because we've seen as this COVID pandemic continues to subsist that some families and individuals may need more assistance than the original time frame that they were eligible for. So things like that, we're trying to find ways to work with all of the ERA grantees moving forward, try to improve this program. So a lot of work to be done. NEHC just sent out a survey this week. Hopefully some of you saw it. We'll probably run it for a couple of weeks and try to put some more announcements out about it. And hopefully you all can take that survey just to tell us how your ERA program is going. We did this survey back in May when tribes were just getting started. Everyone was just getting started. And we got a good data set from that. So we're really hopeful to see kind of the progress and gauge the level of implementation of ERA programs over these last 3 or 4 months. And I think that'll be helpful for us to help identify training, TA needs, help identify some issues that maybe you all have found in implementation that no one really thought about. But then also, just trying to gauge when tribes will hit benchmarks on, spending levels of funding, spending all of the ERA funds, things like that. It helps us advocate for more. If more is needed, helps us advocate, as we saw between ERA 1 and 2, that maybe ERA wasn't the best fit for tribes, so we'll just put more money in the NAHASA program, which is what we saw in the Rescue Plan Act, versus adding more to the rental assistance program. So things like that, these surveys will help us figure out the best approach moving forward, and certainly can share that information in an aggregate form, with other organizations that are advocating for ERA issues as well. So with that, the next slide kind of talks about some of the deadlines here. So I know that's what folks are asking for questions. So generally the deadline to spend all of your ERA funds is September 30th of 2022. So you've got 13 months from now to fully spend all of your ERA funds before it's no longer kind of authorized, and funds would probably need to be returned to Treasury unless another act of Congress changes that result. But there is a deadline this coming September 30th, and it's not so much a deadline, but it's just it's a milestone, I suppose. I wouldn't call it a deadline because people think you have to do something by that date, and that's not necessarily the case. So starting September 30th, Treasury can reallocate funds from one tribal grantee to another tribe. Only the tribes who have spent 65% or more of their existing allocation can receive more funds to this after this September 30th date. Now, that doesn't mean that every tribe who hasn't spent 65% will just automatically lose their funds. It doesn't mean that. So it's not a deadline in that sense, but there is a risk that money, if there's reallocation at all, it obviously comes from one grantee to another. There's not a new pot of money for this. So if there's reallocation, we're working with Treasury to see what their guidelines would be, what their levels of funding spending would be. And we haven't gotten much guidance from Treasury on that. So when we talk about the September 30th date, I don't think it's not a hard date that things are going to happen right after that, because every indication and conversation we've had with Treasury, they're talking about, let's make this program work. How can we make it work for our grantees? Not trying to pull kind of a gotcha and say right on the deadline, let's pull money. But with that in mind, tribes should be spending their ERA funds. And if you're at 20% spending, you're probably going to be more at risk of reallocation than a tribe who may be at 50 or 60%. And that's not saying that there's any timeframes or deadlines yet, but that's kind of where we are now. And we don't have any formal guidance or statements from Treasury on what they're going to do after September 30th. We've requested that they consult with tribes regarding any reallocation before they do it. And, they haven't responded to that yet either. They say they're looking into it. They did hold some webinars, maybe some consultation efforts if people want to call them that earlier, but certainly be mindful of this deadline or this date, September 30th of this year, because things could happen after that, but certainly just encourage all of you to keep working your ERA programs as much as you can. Ed?
Thanks, Tony. I just wanted to underscore that last point, that we don't really know what Treasury's going to do. They have the authorization and encouragement by Congress to reallocate from what would be considered underperforming programs. So that doesn't mean they're going to do that, but to the extent you can get those funds allocate or obligated as much as you can by September 30th, certainly suggesting and strongly advocating all our clients do that. We've had some clients raise the question of, well, should we just let go and give the money back because we are not going to meet that 65% deadline by September 30th. And as Tony has made clear, it isn't a deadline to spend 65%. So there's no need to just give the funds back up front. But there is a need to keep your foot on the gas. I think everyone's trying to get the money out the door as effectively as they can. Tribes are obviously not the only entities having a problem with that. One thing that we're working on in the Northwest Indian Housing Association is a request to Treasury to clarify what they're going to do on September 30th, so we have a better sense of what's happening, and a more of a long shot request to Congress to provide more flexibility for tribes in the use of these funds. Not sure that that's going to get any traction, but figure the answer is no if you don't ask. So I think we're going to put together a resolution to go to NAIHC to see about making that ask. So I just wanted to add those 2 points. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Ed.
Tony?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I won't interrupt if you were going to respond to him.
Oh, no, go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, thank you. And sorry, I do have to leave early. So I just wanted to get my comments in. I put them in the chat, but one comment is, the states are getting a lot of benefit of they meet regularly right now they met weekly when they were putting together their rental relief program. And then now they're meeting regularly on putting together the HAF programs. And I think we could benefit from that kind of sharing and information, and maybe NIHC might be a good place to do that. I know that probably the regional housing associations are doing that, but more nationally, that could be a good effort. Because I do hear from a lot of tribes who are concerned about, this 65% obligation period, and it is obligated period. I know that, we in Alaska, most of us are able to meet it, or we're able to meet it because of our partnership with the state. But on the HAF program, there's so many options that it would be really helpful for us to talk about how those options could actually work in partnerships with our CDFIs, but also just in partnerships that we're looking at, some longer term returns from those investments that we might make out of the HAF program. And I think it would be really helpful for that kind of conversation as we develop our plans, which I know that the tribes don't have to submit their plan by September 30th like the states do. But in my case, for example, because we represent so many tribes under our housing authority, that if the state puts out their plan and I don't have my plan done, I look like I'm not competent, right? And so that's not going to happen. I want to be able to make sure that my plan goes out in, at least close enough when the state puts out their plan, and that there's, and so it'd be very helpful for us to have those conversations sooner than later. So just a recommendation. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And I think we can probably host something like that. I mean, certainly it'd be voluntary for folks to come onto and have this forum at least to talk about HAF issues. So happy to probably facilitate that over the next couple of weeks, or maybe once or twice before at least this initial September 30 deadline on some of the HAF dates. So try to figure out a better way to do that, or announce that, or get people to be able to participate in that. Where are we at? So
and Dave, you're absolutely right. I make sure that everybody knows that they do have to request your tribes have to request for their funds by September 30th if you haven't already done that. And if anybody needs help with that, I'm sure that's another area where Tony or any of us would be willing to do that. So,
Yeah, and maybe we'll probably do some more work announcing that, making sure Tribe's aware. So it's absolutely right. Tribe still has to kind of stake its claim to its allocation. Its allocation is already determined by the formula, but Tribes do need to check in at least and claim that allocation by September 30th. So we'll make sure we announce that a few more times through our newsletters and other posts and forums. Yeah.
and especially if the tribes, like in our case, all of our tribes, they authorize the housing authority to operate the program for them. So that letter, that template letter of authorization might be helpful. So thanks.
And then there's some questions here in the chat about turnaround. I think some tribes have already submitted their HAF plans. Has anyone out there kind of gotten either feedback or approvals on their plans yet? I'm going to assume that in addition to the silence, that there's probably laughter going on behind people's screens as well about that. But once we start hearing of Treasury approving plans, we'll let folks know just so people can be aware of kind of timeframes moving forward. I'll say in conversations with Treasury, there's still been a lot of focus more on the rental program, I would say, than this housing assistance fund. Better or worse, right? I think the ERA program is getting a lot of attention, wanting to get that up and running and spending its fund, but that does kind of leave a lot of folks kind of in the dark a little bit about how to move forward, how to structure their HAF plans. I know Treasury and HUD and our partners at ONAP are working together to try to coordinate training and TA on the tribal side. So that's a great news and great first step there. So we'll be working with our partners at Treasury and HUD to figure out the best way to carry that out and get as much information to you all as we can. I'll try to get to some of these questions here, but just to go over real briefly, and the HAF fund, I know we're running up on the hour in case people need to start dropping off. As it says there, you do have to claim your allocation by the end of the month. You're supposed to get 10% of that allocation up front, and then you have to submit your HAF plan. The waiting on the template guidance, that should be updated. There is a lot of template and guidance on the Treasury website now. But I know there's probably still a lot of open questions about that. So let us know, probably off of this call, but through email, and we'll try to either connect you with folks who have either submitted HAF plans or have some, developed plans or policies in place that other tribes can copy from or look to as guidance, and certainly try to connect you with any training and TA that we get approved or access to through Treasury or HUD. So that's kind of really the update on HAF. And so I don't know if others have questions there, but we'll certainly let people know as we get further along through this process on HAF. And our survey that we sent out was mostly geared toward rental assistance program, but we know a lot of those same questions and comments and concerns about timelines of spending will kind of be mirrored in the HAF program because they're similar in that regard. So, but the HAF program does have a lot more kind of moving pieces on who you need to work with, and essentially there's probably more lenders out there, and some in coordination between tribal programs and tribal native CDFIs and the like. So, so hopefully more to come on the HAF program and answers to some of these questions. Anything specific about that? I see some good conversations going back and forth in the chat there, but any other questions about any of these grants really out of Treasury or HUD? I think this is kind of our last slide before we wind down. So just want to make sure that we're kind of getting the full kind of universe of questions that are out there.
Tony, this is Lorraine Shea with the Fort Hall Housing Authority. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to let everybody know under the emergency rental assistance program, the Treasury sent us an addendum to the contract and extended it to September 30th, 2022. And I don't know if everybody's getting that. So if they extended it, how are they going to recapture funds? Wouldn't that be a legal issue?
I haven't seen any type of agreement like that. So happy.
Yeah, we got one. We got an addendum to our contract.
Okay, well, happy to take a look. I'm sure it should probably be addressed in there. If it's not, I think it's a pretty big probably oversight, unless it's a positive announcement that we haven't heard yet from Treasury about that reallocation piece. But happy to take a look and maybe ask some questions to Treasury what that might look like.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's good, good piece of news there. Any other questions, comments, concerns, suggestions? All right, well, we'll wrap up the call real quick with just some of the random announcements that we always do. So our registration for our legal symposium, this is our next big event, our annual event, of course. We're still hopeful to be able to pull this off in person. It's in December, so we've got time to see kind of how things go, you know, with COVID, public safety, travel, et cetera. But right now, we are moving forward as if this would go on. It's an in-person event in Las Vegas in December, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Registration is open on our website. But of course, we're very mindful of the COVID issues and really the uptick that we've seen across the country. I'm sure a lot of the travel communities are seeing that as well. So, you know, we'll certainly be on the lookout. If things change, we'll make those updates. Certainly, you know, provide refunds if the event is canceled or moved to a virtual format in that sense. But registration is open. We're trying to use that as a gauge to see, you know, who all is interested in travel at this point. I know kind of probably a month or two ago, everything was kind of looking good for travel opening way back up, and people using this as kind of the first big in-person event for housing to really get back together. Now with some of the news over the last couple of weeks, you know, we'll see where it goes, but certainly want to make sure everyone's staying safe out there. So we'll keep this updated as we get closer to the event. It's still 4 months out or so, or I guess three months out. But the registration for that event is open. I guess I don't have any other slides for upcoming dates, but we'll do these legislative committee meetings the first Thursday of each month again to see kind of where things are. Because there's a lot going on, and, you know, happy to facilitate some more calls or meetings. And as Jackie mentioned, just kind of some brainstorming sessions on either HAF or ERA programs, and just make those open meetings for people who have the time or ability to join. But certainly let me know if you think we need to up some of these times on how often we meet through this committee. But right now we've got the first Thursday planned for it's October, November moving forward. And we would meet in person as well at the legal symposium in Las Vegas if we're able to hold that meeting. And just so people know, that would include a members meeting of NAIC. We haven't been able to do a members meeting since 2019 at our annual convention. So we would use this first in-person meeting to carry out a members meeting, vote for board chairman of NAIC, board directors, vote for NAIC resolutions and the like, and have those discussions among the members. So we're hopeful still to get that event off, but we're going to be mindful of safety, of course. So with that, that's kind of the end of the presentation. So we'll open it up for one more minute, I guess, before the end of the hour. So any other final comments or thoughts? Appreciate everyone joining us today.
Tony, this is Gabrielle. I'm sorry, I can't find the lift your hand button.
Sure.
I have a real quick question. The legislative committee in the PM in Las Vegas on Monday, do you know, is that late PM? We're trying to make arrangements, and it's either a nonstop flight that doesn't get to Las Vegas till 2 p.m. or it's a 5-hour, you know, go through a couple of cities to get there.
Yeah, we recognize that's a travel day. It usually starts around 4 local time. So it's really meant to just be kind of the last thing. People come in that day, they can attend that kind of before having the free evening.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's a good question. Thank
you. Tony, this is Juan. I just wanted to make a closing comment, if I may.
Of course.
First of all, I wanted to thank you and your NAIHC team for the stellar work that you do. I believe this is the first real session that I've attended, and it's informative, and you guys are professional and really get your points across. And thank you for answering the questions that I had on the ERA program. It's a lot clearer for me now. Ed also communicated with me, and we might chat with him just to have a clearer path. But I think that here in Washington at the Yakima Nation Housing Authority on the ERA program, I think we're on the same page now, and we know how to go forward, and the 65%, and it's not casting concrete, and we're just gonna get to the finish line with this program. But thank you so much. I'm really grateful and appreciative to be able to listen to this session, and we'll continue to do more. And we'll see if my management approves me to go to Vegas in December. I don't know yet. I
Yeah.
might have to have Ed campaign for me. I don't know. Thank you anyway.
You bet. I certainly appreciate it. I look forward to meeting everyone, seeing everyone in Vegas, hopefully. Yeah, appreciate the comments. We're certainly that's what we're here for, is to just be of service to your programs and try to get as much information to all of you as we can. So if you have questions, of course, don't hesitate to wait for these calls, but reach out to any of us at NHC anytime, and we'll try to be responsive as we can, or at least start that chain of questioning on the agencies or our partners to see how we can be helpful. Any other comments or questions out there? Okay. Well, as always, appreciate you joining us this afternoon or this morning for most of you, and look forward to seeing you all again next month, if not sooner. And always keep us in mind. If you've got questions, we're here to help and want to help your programs as much as we can. So thanks again for joining us, and everyone have a great day and have a great holiday weekend coming up.